Flik and Odessa, the two love-struck leaders of the original Liberation Army. These two fan favourites received a short story titled The Moment of Thunder, which was included in the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 2, a book that released in Japan in May 2001. This short story takes place in the solar year 453, which is the same year as Suikoden Starleap and 2 years before Suikoden 1 begins. It covers how Flik and Odessa first met, as Odessa struggled to unite the many different small rebel factions together before forming the Liberation Army, back when they were known as the Liberation Movement. Before I get into it, do keep in mind that the story of Odessa and the origins of the Liberation Army will be covered in Suikoden Starleap, or at least partially. It's possible that the game may also cover how Flik and Odessa first met, and if it does, it may play out in a similar way to how it does in this short story, or it may differ drastically from how their first encounter is presented in this story. These short stories are a much lower tier of canon. They sometimes contain mistakes and inconsistencies that don't align with the information from the games, and a lot of the events and original characters from these stories aren't acknowledged or referenced in the games or encyclopedias. So the information in this short story could be completely retconned in Starleap, and based on the trailers we've seen so far, I expect much of it outside of the Achilles portion probably will be retconned. I just wanted to give you that little warning in advance. If you don't mind potentially having parts of their origin story spoiled, go right ahead, watch the video, and I hope you enjoy it. If you'd prefer not to risk being potentially spoiled, tune out here and check back later after we've all had a chance to play Starleap. Telling you all not to watch probably isn't the best way to start the video, but it'll be interesting to circle back to this video after Starleap has released to see what the differences are in their story. Chapter 1. The story begins with a man wiping blood off his sword. Odessa had been attacked by a group of 4 men on the road outside of Gregminster, and a man in blue clothing came to her rescue, defeating and killing 3 of the men, with the 4th fleeing. Pools of blood surrounded the bodies, and the blue-clothed man began dragging the bodies off the road into a nearby grove. Odessa immediately understood that his intention was to hide the bodies, and that the long summer grass would ensure that it would take some time before they were found. I don't know about that. I'm pretty sure 3 pools of blood on the road with bloody trails leading into the grass on the side of the road not far from the capital would ensure they're found pretty quickly, but hey. Odessa had been shaken by the attack and grabbed her elbow to feign composure. She felt as if she needed to hide her agitation at the sudden attack by the 4 men and the awe she felt of this stranger who defeated them in an instant. Determined not to let her feelings be known, Odessa picked up her bow that she had dropped during the fight and tried to pick up the body of the last assailant. The blue-clothed man told her not to get her hands dirty, and in a sharp tone, Odessa replied that her hands are already dirty. The sharpness of her tone surprised herself more than it did him. The blue-clothed man was left speechless for a moment before forcibly grabbing the man's body from Odessa and trying to push her away. He told Odessa that he doesn't care if her hands are dirty or not, he doesn't want her to involve herself in hiding the bodies. Odessa refused to let go, and the two carried the last body into the grass. None of the men's bodies had any interesting belongings. They were all wearing featureless clothing and carrying unbranded swords with knives so sharp they could easily sever fingers. The men had nothing to indicate their origin, but they were all well enough equipped to ensure that Odessa's life was taken. A chill ran down Odessa's spine. She turned her head and looked at the man who saved her, and knew that if he hadn't arrived, the attackers certainly would have been successful. The man asked Odessa if he knew who the attackers were, and after a sharp pause, Odessa replied no. The man explained to her that they didn't appear to be highwaymen or bandits, as they were too well equipped. As he was explaining they intended to take her life, the man noticed the expression on Odessa's face and quickly changed the subject. He asked her if she was going to Gregminster, whose walls could be seen not far from where they were. Odessa replied that she is heading there, and asked the man the same question. The man replied that he didn't have any special purpose for travelling. He then kicked the ground and said he shouldn't have let the 4th assailant escape as he turned to face Gregminster, the direction he fled in. The man let out a sigh as he looked back at Odessa and asked her what she plans to do. Now that the fighting was over and the bodies were dealt with, Odessa had regained her composure. She finally got a good look at the man who saved her and was surprised to see he was much younger than she initially thought. Even though this young man had just taken the lives of 3 people without breaking a sweat, Odessa couldn't help but notice that his eyes were pure. As Odessa stared back at him, the young man quickly averted his gaze. Odessa and the young man then spotted two mounted soldiers travelling down the road coming from the direction of Gregminster. Odessa momentarily felt worried, but there was no sign the soldiers were being accompanied by the survivor of the men who attacked her. The young man placed his hand on the hilt of his sword, ready to make a move, but Odessa stopped him, placing her hand on his and holding the sword down. It was too late to hide from the soldiers as they had already been spotted, and Odessa didn't want any more bloodshed. She hoped the soldiers wouldn't spot the bodies of the dead men or notice that there had been a fight as the blood had begun being absorbed into the ground. I'm no expert, but it's only been a few minutes since the fighting stopped. The author stated pools of blood. That much blood isn't going to get absorbed into the ground that quickly, and it's going to leave plenty of staining. Plus it's a dirt road, so the bodies being dragged would have left a bloody trail, and surely the grass would be dirty too, but whatever. Anyway, Odessa told the young man to shut up and to follow her lead as she placed her arms around him and pulled him closer. The man's body tensed up in confusion as Odessa took his hands and placed them around her waist. She leaned her head against him and whispered in his ear, asking him why he's frozen up. She told him to run his fingers through her hair and to embrace her as if they were a couple, and ordered him to do it quickly. The man tried to retort but couldn't muster any words. Odessa glanced over his shoulder and spotted the two soldiers pointing at them and whispering to each other. From the perspective of the soldiers, they must have been two lovers who snuck away to spend some time with each other. Odessa pushed the young man back against a tree and caressed his cheeks, using her arm to conceal the traces of blood that remained on his clothes. The young man was so confused by Odessa's actions that he didn't even think to hug her back. The faint laughter of the soldiers could be heard as they stopped to look at the two. Growing impatient with the young man's hesitation to play his part, Odessa pulled his head closer somewhat forcefully. The feel of his hair in her hands was unexpectedly soft. She pressed her head against the man's chest and felt his heartbeat in what must have felt like an eternity to him. The soldiers' laughter soon faded as they continued down the road. Odessa let out a sigh of relief, and after a moment's pause, she gently moved away from the young man. Odessa asked him if he was okay, and the young man responded, but Odessa couldn't hear what he was saying as he muttered with his hand covering his mouth. Odessa asked him if she disgusts him that much, and the man replied that it's not like that. Odessa looked at him, but he cleared his throat and brushed his hand through his hair to avoid her gaze. She told him he's very courageous, but she thought he'd screw up and they'd have to fight the soldiers. The young man inspected the blood on his clothes and responded in a grumpy tone that she was the one who was attacked, so why does he have to hide from the Imperial soldiers? Odessa replied that she doesn't want any trouble. The man responded by telling her that it's not often that someone is targeted for their life, and she seems to be used to it. Odessa jokingly asked him if that's what it looked like, and the man replied with a straight, serious face that as far as he can tell, it does. Odessa told him that he doesn't know her and she doesn't think he'd believe her. Noticing that Odessa was looking at the bodies of the men he had slain, the young man tried to change the subject by commenting that he heard Gregminster was a big city, and if it's as busy as he heard, it'll be easy to make some money. Suddenly, the expression on his face changed to a gentle smile as he offered to escort her to her destination. Odessa questioned him, asking him why he wants to accompany her. She told him that she appreciates his help but rejected his offer, insisting she'll be fine by herself from here. The young man pointed in the direction of Gregminster and told her that the man who escaped ran in that direction. He questioned why she'd want to go there alone while the man is still out there. Odessa asked the man what's it to him if she wants to travel alone. She quickly lowered her gaze when she noticed the sharpness of her words. She knew the young man's offer was well-intentioned, however, she was reluctant to allow a stranger to follow her as she couldn't be sure that a problem wouldn't arise. The young man responded with an annoyed tone that it's not unreasonable for him to be worried considering she was just attacked by a group of well-armed men. He picked up his bag that had been left at the base of a tree and commented that it's his fault for letting one of the men escape and that he should have captured or killed them all. He told Odessa that she could go by herself if she wanted to, but he'd feel bad about it given the circumstances. The young man stepped out onto the road but didn't take any steps forward until he knew she was coming with him. Odessa let out a sigh and told the young man what her name was. She wondered if he even knew how difficult it was for her to reveal her name. She then asked him what his name was, as she still didn't know the name of the person who had saved her life. The man turned around and told her that his name was Flik, and as he answered, Odessa couldn't help but notice that his eyes were as blue as the sky. And that's the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Chapter 2 opens with Flik and Odessa making their way through the busy market stalls in downtown Gregminster. A child came running through the crowd and threw himself into Flik. Flik looked at the child and asked him if he was hurt, but the child pushed Flik away and told him he needs to be careful as he disappeared back into the crowd. Flik staggered as he was repeatedly bumped into by the crowd of people walking through the street. Odessa grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the crowd. She asked him if he was okay, and Flik responded by telling her how amazing the market is. He asked her if there was a festival happening, but told her that the amount of people is making him feel dizzy. Odessa was puzzled by how this brilliant young swordsman could be so naive and know nothing of the world. She told him that the market is always this busy and perhaps he's just overwhelmed as it's his first time in the capital. She then told Flik that he doesn't have to force himself to accompany her. Flik crossed his arms as he glanced at the crowd. He told Odessa that he's just not used to large crowds, that she might laugh at him for it, but he thinks it's dangerous. Odessa responded that she was born in Gregminster, so she's used to the large crowds. Flik then told her that they should keep moving and that he'd protect her until she gets to where she was going, just in case she's attacked again. After a brief pause, Flik once again asked Odessa who were the men who attacked her. Odessa responded that she already told him she doesn't know, but after answering, she wondered if she should reveal the truth to Flik, as if he hadn't intervened and saved her life, it would have been her laying dead on the road. Odessa tried to change the subject by asking Flik if he was a mercenary and reminding him that he said earlier he could make a lot of money in a place as busy as this. Flik responded that he's not a mercenary. He explained to her that he's from the warrior's village and that the village has a custom where when men come of age, they're sent out into the world on a journey of manhood to prove themselves, and they can't return home until they've achieved feats of bravery. Odessa asked him if he's achieved any feats yet and held back a laugh as she noticed the blank plain expression on Flik's face. Flik then let out a slight sarcastic smile and said that he made the right choice coming to the capital. He told Odessa that when he says feats of bravery, he's not talking about small accomplishments like defeating a few bandits on the road. He wants to achieve something big before returning home. He told her that he'd heard many disturbing stories and rumours in the villages he visited about different groups calling themselves part of the liberation movement. Flik said he was afraid of the Empire, but the rumours he'd been hearing about the liberation movement made his blood boil. With a childlike innocence and naivete, he said that the liberation movement name was just a name, and commented that he'd be laughed out of his village if he counted rounding up a few rebels as a feat of bravery. He then noticed the expression on Odessa's face and asked her if it was something he said. Odessa replied by telling him it was nothing, but Flik continued by asking her what's the matter. The brightness faded from Flik's face as he suspected he was the reason for Odessa's sudden sour mood, and he once again asked her if he did or said something wrong. Odessa once again replied no, and Flik concerningly asked her what's really going on. Odessa regretted causing him to lose his smile, but ever since the death of her lover, she had tried her best to keep her emotions hidden from others. Odessa turned away from Flik and covered her face with her hood, but she couldn't escape Flik's concerned gaze. She told Flik not to mind her. Flik looked at her with a troubled expression, and Odessa commented, "Because eyes like yours." Flik confusingly asked her what's wrong with his eyes, and Odessa embarrassingly replied, "You heard me." Flik turned away, puffing his face, as Odessa muttered to herself, "Such brooding eyes." Flik tried to change the subject by telling Odessa it was getting dark and they should find somewhere to get her to safety and to get a meal. Odessa responded by asking him if he has money to pay for lodging. Flik searched his pockets and then began tapping his whole body, checking for his wallet before commenting that he lost his wallet. Odessa told him that he was pickpocketed by the kid who ran into him earlier. Flik stood in shock as he stared dumbfounded in the direction that the child had run off in. Odessa sighed as she pulled out a small leather purse and handed Flik a silver coin. She told him to think of it as a thank you for earlier. Flik told her to wait a minute, and in a loud, offended tone, he asked her if she thinks the only reason he helped her was for money. Odessa told him to lower his voice and to take the money, but Flik became irritated and told Odessa that he didn't need it. She begged him to take the money and thanked him for all of his help, telling him that it's time they part ways as he'll be in danger as long as he stays with her. Flik asked her what she meant and wondered if she was trying to scare him. As Odessa replied that's not it, Flik suddenly grabbed her by the shoulder and told her not to turn around. Odessa tried to reply, but Flik whispered in her ear to blend into the crowd and run to safety. She called out Flik's name, but when she turned around, she saw Flik moving through the crowd. She then noticed what Flik had noticed. In the midst of the crowd, no more than a dozen steps away, was the survivor of the group who attacked her earlier. The moment the man spotted Flik and Odessa, he fled through the crowd. Flik chased after him, weaving his way through the busy market street. After losing sight of Flik, Odessa followed his advice and escaped through the crowd into a nearby alley. Concerned for Flik's safety, she looked back at the street but realized it was too dangerous to wait for him alone in a dark alley. She could hear the sound of laughter nearby coming from what seemed to be a tavern. Odessa made her way through the alley towards the tavern and saw several women outside calling out to men on the streets. One of the women had flaxen hair braided to one side and was dressed in silk. Her voice was familiar to Odessa, and Odessa shifted her hood slightly and softly whispered, "Won't you talk to me, Zella?" Zella stopped moving and glanced at Odessa as if not wanting to be identified. Zella looked around the area before approaching Odessa. Zella was quite tall, taller than Flik, and as she embraced Odessa, the muscles on her arms rose strongly through the puffy sleeves on her dress. Zella told Odessa that she'd been worried about her and that she'd heard rumors she was still alive. Odessa replied by saying she was sorry, and Zella asked her if she was here to see the old man. Just as Zella was about to lead Odessa into the building, she stopped and paused before asking Odessa who the man behind her is. Odessa turned around and saw Flik in the alley, effortlessly dragging a man on the ground. Odessa didn't recognize the man Flik had caught. He was different from the one he had chased through the market. Flik remarked how popular Odessa is. Odessa could tell from the sound of his voice that he was in a bad mood. Flik told her that he's got bad news, and more bad news, and then asked her which she wants to hear first. Odessa asked him what's the first bad news. Flik told her that the person who attacked her escaped again, so he turned back and followed her as he was worried about her safety and was surprised to see that there was another man following her. Odessa commented that must have been the second bad news too, and then asked him what's the third piece of bad news. Flik pulled out a knife from his waist and threw it on the ground by his feet. The man he had caught tried to reach for the knife, but Flik kicked the knife away and knocked him to the ground. He then told Odessa that the knife was coated with poison, and if the knife so much as grazed her, it would have been enough to kill her. Ignoring Flik's words, Zella asked Odessa who he was. Odessa replied that they crossed paths earlier when he saved her and escorted her to Gregminster. She asked Zella to thank him for his kindness. Zella laughed and invited Odessa inside the building. After Odessa went inside, Zella approached Flik and cracked her knuckles, commenting that hospitality is their area of expertise. And that's the end of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Odessa entered a dimly lit room where a sweet-smelling incense was burning. A few women were conversing quietly in the corner, all looking as fabulous as Zella. When they noticed Odessa, they stopped talking. Odessa nodded to them so faintly that Flik almost missed it. The women only responded with their eyes. Odessa turned around and saw Zella dragging Flik by his waist with force. The man Flik had caught was also effortlessly grabbed by another woman and taken down the stairs into the basement. Zella chuckled at her companions as she told them they got a great harvest tonight. Flik looked at the women with a startled expression as they began shouting and cheering wildly. The women circled Flik and began dragging him along, and Flik found himself unable to resist the unusual strength of their arms. Zella called Flik a handsome man and asked him if it was his first time visiting a place like this. She then told Flik that experience in playing dangerous games is essential for a good man and invited him for a drink. Odessa made her way up the stairs as Flik sat like a pet wedged between the women with an innocent expression on his face. He suddenly had a strong feeling that he should leave and that he shouldn't be involved with Odessa anymore, but he stood up and made his way towards the stairs to follow after her. Zella grabbed the scruff of his neck and pulled him back, but Flik mumbled a few words at her and Zella's expression turned serious. Flik shook himself free of Zella's grasp and followed Odessa. Even in the dim lighting, Odessa could see that Flik's expression was stiff. She told him not to worry, that this establishment is owned by an acquaintance of hers. She then asked him if he doesn't like alcohol, as she shrugged, knowing that wasn't his concern. Flik responded that he already told her he wasn't going to leave her alone until she was safe. Odessa could tell by the serious look in his eyes that he meant what he said, and that his words didn't have any romantic meaning. Flik again asked Odessa what's really going on and who these people are, that they already seem to be aware of the assassins and the men tracking her down. He commented that he's the only person who seems to be in the dark about what's happening and demanded to know who she really is. Odessa averted her gaze and in an angry tone she snapped at Flik. She reminded him of his words that capturing members of the liberation movement wouldn't be much of an accomplishment and asked him why he doesn't do it anyway if he believes the rumors he's heard. Flik fell silent and Odessa couldn't bring herself to turn around and look at him. She thought this would be goodbye forever to his warm smile and broody eyes. She then told Flik that neither she nor anybody else here would simply roll over and be captured. She added that it's probably best if they go their separate ways from here and if he forgets about ever meeting her. Flik snapped back in anger, asking Odessa what the hell she's thinking. He grabbed her by the shoulders and turned her around to face him. He told her it's madness to stick her head into something dangerous like this and that she's going to be killed by Imperial soldiers if she keeps playing stupid games. Odessa's astonishment at Flik's outburst made her even angrier as she questioned if he really just called the liberation movement a stupid game. Flik snorted and commented in a snarky tone that she must just be having some fun. He then questioned what the liberation movement really was and began parroting the rumors he had heard before. Flik then grabbed Odessa's hand roughly, telling her to look at her hand and commenting how funny it is. Odessa told him to let go and asked him what's wrong with her hand. Flik responded that even small children have hands rougher than hers, that her hands look like she's never had to work for her food, that her hands are pretty like pottery and that she looks like a princess who's cherished like a decoration in court. Reaching Odessa's thumb, he then questioned her on why she uses a bow and commented that ornamental girls like her don't draw bows. Odessa shook off Flik's hand and snapped back, asking him if he thinks her bow is just for decoration. Flik told her it's dangerous to play with fire and that the Empire mercilessly deals with anyone considered a rebel, even women and children. Odessa reminded Flik that she already told him that she's got her hands dirty. She rolled up her sleeve and showed Flik the scars on her arm. The scars were beginning to heal and fade, but Flik could tell they were cuts from a blade. Odessa told him that she suffered those wounds from the Imperial soldiers she killed when trying to save the life of a man called Achilles who once aided the rebels. She then told Flik that even when she tries to remember Achilles' name, it's a name that no longer has any meaning. Flik stood in silence staring at Odessa's scars. His eyes slowly moved up until their gazes met. Flik's eyes gave away his thoughts and it took Odessa some time before she could bring herself to open up. She told Flik about Achilles, how he secretly helped underground movements who resisted imperial oppression despite being a member of the aristocracy. When he was found out to be helping rebels, he was arrested for treason and sentenced to death, but before his death, as a final request, he was allowed to marry Odessa before his execution. Odessa let out a slight laugh and Flik wondered if it was really in the form of a smile. Odessa then said that she still sometimes wonders what other paths she could have chosen in life, and perhaps it would have been better if she let Achilles die quietly instead of continuing his dream. Flik spoke Odessa's name softly, and Odessa continued the story. She explained that after her and Achilles said their vows, she grabbed the sword of the guard closest to her and tried to fight her way out, but during their escape, archers opened fire and only she escaped. She told Flik that she's not playing with fire, that she really is a rebel. Odessa looked up at Flik, but his expression was hard to read and his lips were shut tight. She told Flik that her story sounds silly and the liberation movement is still at a young stage where they're laughed at and not taken seriously. She added that normally there's no way a young woman like her could be the leader of such a movement, but her dramatic escape from her wedding made her famous. Flik then asked her if that's why she was being chased by those men. Odessa replied that someone has to take center stage, that organizations need leaders, and she's determined to carry on Achilles' legacy. Flik removed one of his gloves and gently reached for Odessa's cheek, softly wiping away her tears with his fingers, but as if touching something hot, he quickly withdrew his hand. Brushing away the rest of her tears with her own hands, Odessa turned away from Flik and commented that the so-called leader of the liberation movement is nothing more than a child herself. Flik apologized to Odessa for all the terrible things he said to her. Looking down at his feet and fiddling with the hilt of his sword, Flik tried to explain to Odessa that his village was granted autonomy by the Empire because of its track record of providing highly skilled warriors to the Imperial Army. Flik struggled to convey what he was trying to say as he wasn't a very good talker and his message was very jumbled. He told her that he doesn't care if the Empire wins or loses. He then corrected himself and shook his head as he said that was a lie, he just didn't want to know. He then muttered to Odessa how strong she is. Odessa looked at him in surprise as Flik told her that while he was listening to her story, he wondered what he would have done if he was in her position. He doesn't know if he would have fled and escaped or used the pain to stand up as a leader like she did. Odessa replied that if he was in her position and caught up in a terrible battle like she was, she'd hope that he'd be dragged along by an unlucky and skilled warrior who didn't know what was going on. The two involuntarily laughed at each other. Zella came walking up the stairs and told Flik that since he's from the warrior's village, it's no wonder he's as strong as he is. Flik had a disgruntled look on his face. He didn't like that Zella had been listening in on their conversation. I mean, it's kind of hard not to, since half of their conversation was the two of them shouting at each other and arguing in a room full of people, but again, hey. Zella explained to Odessa that the founder of the warrior's village was known as Cliff the Crusader, an ancient warrior who protected the Lower Mar region from the Holy Kingdom of Harmonia. Zella looked at Flik's body up and down and commented that Cliff was an incredibly talented warrior skilled with both a sword and rune magic. Zella then asked Flik if he can use a rune too, and that if someone like him was protecting Odessa, then big sister Zella wouldn't have to worry so much about her. Flik questioned Zella's use of the word sister as he crossed his arms and stared at Zella suspiciously. He then commented that it feels more like there's another man standing next to him. Zella began laughing and told Flik he doesn't know what he means. He then opened one of the upstairs doors and entered the room. So if you haven't caught on yet, Zella is a man and so are many of the people in the brothel. They're a small group of rebels that dress in women's clothing and disguise themselves as harlots to avoid Imperial detection. Odessa asked Flik if he can really use rune magic. Flik pulled down the leather glove in his left hand and showed her the lightning rune he possesses. According to the games, the rune is on his right hand. The door Zella had previously entered opened. Zella came outside and beckoned Odessa and Flik, asking them to come inside, and that's the end of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. The trio entered the room, which was somewhat smelly and damp. The silhouette of a man standing with his back to them could be spotted inside the room. He murmured that he hadn't expected to see Odessa again so soon and told her that he had heard rumours and was worried about her. Odessa replied to the man, whose name was Alec, that she's glad he's safe too. She told him that she's based in Lenin Camp now and that there are people there who support the liberation movement, that she came here to request the aid of those Achilles supported so that they can join forces and fight the Empire together. In a tense voice full of despair, Alec asked her if she's asking him, an old man who can no longer wield a sword and has no way of resisting, to fight the Empire. Alec turned around and held out his arms to reveal that his hands were missing all of his fingers. Odessa covered her mouth with both of her hands in shock. Alec explained to her that Imperial soldiers cut off his fingers instead of executing him to serve as an example of what happens to those who help the liberation movement. Zella chimed in and told Odessa that Alec sheltered the people who were suspected by the Imperials of helping her escape. Alec interrupted and told Zella not to say that or to blame Odessa. He then told Odessa that the loss of his fingers isn't something to lament. He explained to her that he's aware she's raising a flag for the liberation movement to resist the Empire, but the spirit of those who remained in the capital has been crushed and they're barely surviving. Odessa was left speechless, and for a moment she wondered how many of the arrows that were lodged in Achilles' back when he died were meant for her. With pain in her voice, she then asked Alec what exactly did the Imperials crush, because the only thing they can hurt and rob them of is their bodies. With her voice shaking and her eyes shut tight, Odessa ran her fingers along the scars on her arm. She could feel Flik's gaze behind her as she declared she'll risk her own life to stop the Empire from hurting any more people. She told Alec that every time she watches someone die, she sheds a tear, and she hates it. She then looked at Alec and told him that she can't command or coerce him to help her, but that she needs more power to accomplish their dreams. Alec gazed at her intensely and told her to choose the way of the sword if that's her wish. He explained to her that every sword has the power to deliver justice, but that power is a double-edged sword that can just as easily deliver evil. He reminded her that if she does choose the way of the sword and she makes the wrong choices, she could lead many lives to ruin. Odessa nodded, unable to muster any words. Alec spoke to her quietly, telling her that there are people waiting for the light in which to entrust their fate, and asked Odessa if she truly swears that there's no wavering doubt in her heart. Odessa said that she swears, for those who have died, for the blood she has shed, and for the responsibility she has shouldered. She then asked Alec if that's not enough. Alec held out his club-like arms. Odessa, following his prompt, held out her own arms. Alec painfully traced his fingerless hands on Odessa's palms and then along the scars on her arms. He told Odessa it must be painful for someone like her to have to be a warrior, and advised her to become someone who listens to others instead, as only those who know and overcome pain can be the light that brings order. Zella, who was growing irritated with Alec's long-winded speech, chimed in and told Odessa they'll join her. Alec then turned to face Flik and asked him to please continue protecting Odessa. Odessa began to reply, trying to explain to Alec that Flik wasn't a member of the liberation movement, but Flik cut her off in a calm voice and responded that he understands. Flik set his gaze at Odessa, who turned back to face him. Even in the darkness, she could see his blue eyes. Alec then told Odessa that it was crazy for her to come here alone, and Zella questioned why she didn't send a messenger in her place, as a leader needs to be more careful and not to take such risks. Odessa stood silent for a moment while she processed their words. She then asked them, "Then it wasn't you?" Zella tilted his head and responded, "Huh?" Odessa responded that she received word they were survivors of the liberation movement in Gregminster and that they wanted to meet with her, so she came here to meet with them. Odessa and Zella realized the truth at the same time. It was a trap. At that moment, the downstairs door started banging violently. Flik rushed out of the room, quickly followed by Odessa and Zella. Torches could be seen in the streets outside the window, and Imperial soldiers were moving through the streets. They were already breaking down the front door, but the sturdy oak door withstood their attacks. All of the women who had been downstairs took action without hesitation, grabbing hidden and concealed weapons, kicking over tables to create makeshift barriers, and cutting their dresses for better movement. Flik groaned what the hell, that he'd been deceived. He thought they were all women and that Zella was the only person disguised as a woman. Zella told him that half of them are women and half of them are men, and that the men disguised themselves as women to hide themselves from the Imperials. The front door began to give from the repeated blows from the Imperial soldiers. Zella turned to Flik and told him that just in case, he doesn't need to worry about anything strange because Odessa is a proper woman. But then Zella's voice was drowned out by a roaring sound coming from downstairs. The Imperial soldiers had finally broken the door. A soldier tried to push himself through the gap in the door, but his torso was sliced open by one of the men standing by the door. Soon, more soldiers pushed their way through the door, and in no time, the entire downstairs was in a state of conflict. Zella stripped off his dress to reveal a sword hanging from his shoulder, his eyes gleefully following the fighting downstairs as he commented, "It's been a while, and it's making his blood boil." Odessa called out Zella's name. Zella turned to her and told her not to worry about the fighting and advised her to escape through the window, promising that they'll follow once she gets to safety. Zella then turned to Flik and told him it's important that he protects Odessa. An Imperial soldier then rushed up the stairs and raised his sword, but without even looking at him, Zella knocked him down the stairs with a single kick. Zella then pushed Odessa towards the window as several more soldiers rushed towards the stairs. He told her that events have already started flowing and no one can stop it, that many people will gather under her name and they'll need her guidance. Odessa replied maybe she's trying to go against the flow. Zella laughed at her comments and pushed her out the window as he told her to go. Flik jumped out after her and urged Odessa to run. Flik was like a different person from the awkward, naive man when he first arrived in the capital. He now moved with a purpose. The two ran through the alley until the sound of fighting from the brothel faded into the distance. Odessa tried to stop and turn around as she wanted to help, but Flik grabbed her and pulled her back towards him. He told her that if they go back now, they'll only be a hindrance. Odessa tried to argue, but Flik told her they need to get to safety and that Zella and the others will follow after. Suddenly, the hand of a soldier sprung out of the darkness and grabbed Odessa's arm. She tried to shake it off, but the soldier's strength was too much and she was knocked to her knees. Flik turned around and swung his sword, cutting the soldier's hand off. The soldier screamed as his severed hand rolled on the ground. Flik pushed Odessa against the wall behind him and fought the soldiers that appeared one after another. Without losing his focus on the soldiers, he quickly picked up the sword from the soldier whose hand he cut off and threw it to Odessa. As the soldiers made their move, Flik reacted sharply, cutting down two of the men, but one of the soldiers dodged Flik's attack and swung his sword at Odessa. Odessa managed to block the attack, but the sword she was gripping with both of her hands was too heavy for her and she lost her balance. The soldier then tackled her to the ground. Flik called out Odessa's name, but she couldn't see him in the darkened alley. The soldier pinned her down with his knee, her cheek scraping the rough cobblestone ground. Odessa began to panic as the soldier forcibly grabbed her arm and held a knife to her throat. The soldier ordered Flik to drop his weapon, otherwise he'd kill Odessa. Flik didn't even flinch, he stood staring at the remaining soldiers with his sword pointed at them. Odessa tried not to express the pain or fear in her voice and told Flik to continue fighting. She accepted that this was her fate and that even if she was killed here, Flik was skilled enough to fight his way out and escape. Just then, Odessa looked on in horror as Flik lowered his sword and dropped it to the ground. The soldiers approached Flik and told him if he resists, they'll decapitate Odessa where they stand. Flik craned his neck and stared at the approaching soldiers. Flik's gaze terrified the soldiers, and one of the men slammed the hilt of his sword into Flik's shoulder. The pommel of the sword cut his cheek, but Flik stayed still. Odessa involuntarily averted her eyes. Flik shook his head and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, but the expression on his face didn't change. He didn't even show the slightest hint of pain, and his eyes were now filled with a terrible rage. The soldier holding the knife to Odessa's throat told the other men that Flik is dangerous and ordered them to kill him. Odessa shouted out if they're going to kill someone, to kill her instead. Flik told Odessa to close her eyes. She noticed the glove on his left hand was pulled down and immediately knew his intention and closed her eyes tightly. Flik's hand began to glow and suddenly thunder roared through the sky. The soldiers looked up in astonishment as a thick bolt of lightning exploded through the darkness overhead. The light was so bright that Odessa couldn't help but let out a scream. The blast of the lightning blew the soldier away from Odessa. Flik reacted instantly, twisting the arm of the soldier in front of him, then grabbing his sword and cutting his throat. Odessa knelt on the cobblestone ground and watched as Flik made quick work of the Imperial soldiers. A strong thought flashed through Odessa's mind. The brilliant lightning strike just now was Flik himself. And that's the end of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Flik helped Odessa to her feet and told her he was worried he might have accidentally charred her with his rune. The afterimage of the lightning flash still burned in Odessa's eyes. Even now there were remnants of thunder tickling her skin. Odessa became aware that she was beginning to become used to the sight of death and was no longer bothered by the smell or sight of blood. Flik looked into her eyes and took off his leather gloves, touching Odessa's cheeks with his bare hands. He commented that she's got a cut on her face and blood is coming out. Without responding, Odessa stared at Flik's rune, which still glowed on his hand. She wondered why Flik had chosen the lightning rune. It was the opposite of the calmness of Achilles, but she sensed that Flik and his rune had the same sincerity. As soon as she realized what she was thinking, an unspeakable awe ran through her body. Concerned about her cut, Flik again asked her if it hurt and asked her to say something. Odessa still stood in silence, knowing that a warrior like him could have survived that fight without damaging as much as a hair on his head, but he threw his sword down in order to protect her. Flik held out his hand and told Odessa they should go. Odessa suddenly slapped Flik in the face. The shock hurt more than the pain, and Flik looked like a child who had been unreasonably reprimanded. Odessa shouted at him, demanding to know why he did that. She didn't want to shout at him, but she couldn't hold back her emotions. Flik stammered and rubbed his blushing cheeks as he told Odessa it couldn't be helped and that it would have been better if the lightning struck only the soldiers. Odessa responded that's not what she meant. As her shoulders trembled and tears welled up in her eyes, she told Flik he didn't have to throw down his sword and questioned him if he wants to die. Flik didn't answer, all he could do was kick the stones by his feet. Odessa bit her lip. Flik had no idea how much pain she was in. Just like Achilles, Flik was prepared to sacrifice himself for her to survive, and she wondered how many more times she'd have to experience that pain. In her mind, Odessa was ready to scream the name Achilles. He would never know her suffering and how much she struggled to pursue his ideals. Flik broke the silence by muttering to Odessa to forget the reason why he did what he did. The tone of his voice was so gentle that Odessa involuntarily looked up at him. Flik told her that he can't explain why he did what he did, he just felt it was right. Odessa was speechless. Flik was nothing like Achilles, yet his words overlapped with Achilles' gentle tone. Odessa told Flik that she doesn't want anyone to die because of her, that if he joins the liberation movement he'll have to kill again in the future, and even those around him will die as well. Flik looked straight at Odessa and told her that her destiny is no longer hers alone. He asked her if she knew how many people she'd need to rally to her cause to achieve her goals. He told her it's hard to watch someone die, that she could be indifferent to death, but nobody wants to follow a leader like that. But she also can't collapse under the weight of debt, and that she knows the importance of life more than anyone else. Odessa looked at Flik, whose hand was once again stretched out to her. Flik quietly told her they should go. Odessa stood in silence as she thought about what Flik's words meant. She wanted him to remain by her side, but she didn't want him to be tormented by guilt or crushed by responsibility like she was. She wondered if it would be selfish of her to want him to come with her as a rippling longing ran through her body. Flik again called out to Odessa with his hand held out, urging her to come with him. She admired Flik's strength and wondered if he was even aware of the strength he possessed. Odessa finally snapped out of her thoughts and responded to Flik, saying they should go. As she took his hand and felt the warmness of his touch, she noticed the smile had once again returned to his face. And that's it for Flik and Odessa's backstory. As I mentioned at the beginning, this backstory came from a short story titled The Moment of Thunder from the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 2 that released in Japan in May 2001. If you're wondering what happened to Zella and Alec, their fates are unknown following the battle in the brothel. I guess you could say that since neither character appeared in Suikoden 1, they're probably dead, but this story released almost 6 years after Suikoden 1 did, so these characters didn't actually exist at the time the game was made. They were mentioned in the Suikoden Encyclopedia that released in 2002, but there was no mention of them in the updated Suikoden Kiwami Encyclopedia from 2010. So are they canon? Are they not canon? Were they canon at one point but now they're not? I don't know. Will we possibly see them in Starleap? Hopefully, but I wouldn't hold my breath. Anyway, if you're watching this video after Starleap has released, the information in this video could very well have been retconned, and if you're coming back to this video after previously watching it and playing Starleap, what do you think of the differences between the two stories? So we've only got a few more short stories to go. The last poll I held for which short story you wanted ended with Flik and Odessa getting 80% of the vote, while Sasuke and Templeton only received 10% each. Most of you might think you won't care about either of those characters' short stories, but Tyr is heavily involved in Sasuke's story, so you might enjoy that one, so maybe I'll do that next. After those two, Gremio's will be the only one remaining, but I've already covered his story in the history of the Scarlet Moon Empire and War of Succession videos, which most of you have already seen. I'll probably make a more in-depth standalone video of his eventually, but I'm sure you understand why I'm not exactly itching to cover his story for a third time when you're already aware of the key details. Anyway, that's it for this video. If there are any other Suikoden or non-related Suikoden topics you want me to make videos on, do let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.